What would you do if you woke up in a world that didn't know physics existed?
And the only thing standing between you and a noose was a notebook full of numbers.
Dan Cross is a structural engineer from Seattle, the kind of man who looks at a building and sees everything wrong with it.
He can't walk past a cracked wall without calculating when it'll fall.
He can't cross a bridge without estimating its load capacity. It's not a gift, it's a curse.
And then one afternoon, he falls down an elevator shaft on a construction site. 3 seconds of free fall, and the world goes dark.
He wakes up face first in the snow, on a mountain trail between 2 walls of gray rock.
Cold hits his face before his mind even catches up.
He opened his eyes and sees a white sky.
Snow is getting into his mouth, his nose. His body is lying on frozen granite. His fingers move, his ribs ache, but nothing cracks.
He rolls onto his side and pushes himself up.
The hard hat is still on his head. The reflective vest is still on his shoulders.
The tape measure is still on his belt.
He unscrews his thermos and sniffs. Cold coffee. The world around him smells of snow and stone and something burnt.
And then he looks up. 2 halberds are aimed directly at his throat.
2 men stand over him in chainmail and open visor helmets. Dan's brain, because it cannot stop being an engineer even now, immediately notes the poor sharpening on the tips.
Low carbon steel, heat treatment done by eye.
Center of gravity shifted too far toward the tip, awkward in close combat.
He orders himself to stop analyzing medieval iron and focus on not dying.
The odor guard is barking something. The language is foreign, but fragments stick.
Dan recognizes it from 4 semesters of college German, crammed into his head because the professor was pretty.
The older one wants to finish off the demon in the orange helmet.
The younger one argues it's better to interrogate him first.
Dan raises his hands. Slowly. Very slowly. He pulls out his notebook and opens it to a page with a bridge sketch.
His latest project back home, an arch bridge. Load calculations in the corner, moment diagrams, pier cross-sections.
He drew it on the plane to the site. He turns the notebook toward the guards and stammers in broken German.
He says he's a builder. He can repair a bridge that won't collapse.
The older guard stares hard at the straight lines, the ruler marks, the load arrows, the neat numbers.
He stares at Dan, then back at the drawing.
Then he says quietly to the younger one, "Take him to the captain."
This one isn't a demon. This one is worse.
412 steps later, Dan walks through the wooden gate of a border outpost.
He counts them out of habit. The outpost clings to a rocky ledge, log palisade, 2 watchtowers, rough-hewn stone barracks.
Dan looks at the walls and sees cracks before he sees anything else.
The foundation is sinking on the east side. The left watchtower leans 2 degrees.
It will collapse in a couple of years.
His brain cannot look at a structure without seeing its pain.
The captain waits inside at a table of crooked planks. A woman, tall, a scar across her eyebrow, short dark hair, chainmail over leather.
The sword at her hip is a work sword, not a ceremonial one.
Captain Adele Holt sizes Dan up from hard hat to boots.
She asks who he is. He says an engineer.
The word means nothing to her. He says a builder.
She asks where he's from. He says from far away. She says that's not an answer.
He doesn't argue.
She asks what he can do.
He says, "Build things that don't fall down."
She is silent. Then she stands up and snaps, "Let's go."
300 steps east, Dan sees the bridge.
A stone arch spanning a 30-meter gorge, the only route to the outpost from the east.
The stone has blackened with age. Grass pushes through the railing.
And the bridge is sick. Dan knows it the moment he sees it.
A crack runs from the keystone down the right side of the arch, not along the mortar joint, but through the stone itself. That is very bad.
Holt tells him the bridge has been cracking for a year.
Mages from the capital's guild came to inspect it and demanded 100 gold pieces to renew the runes. The outpost doesn't have that kind of money. The outpost has no money at all.
She says, "You're a builder. Tell us what's wrong."
Dan sets his notebook on a stone and takes off his helmet. He drops to his stomach at the edge and looks under the arch.
Snow falls down his car.
He sees a second crack underneath, parallel to the first, even worse than he thought.
He walks the entire length of the bridge and taps every stone with his knife handle.
A dull thud means the stone is sound. A ring means a void.
7 out of 40 stones ring. He opens his notebook and measures. Width of the arch. Thickness of the vault.
Weight of the decorative cornice on the right side. He stops.
That cornice, carved, ornate, absolutely useless, and heavy.
A full ton of stone hanging directly where the bridge is most vulnerable.
Someone once decided to beautify the bridge and hung a ton of dead weight on its weakest point. Dan reads his calculations and straightens up.
2 months. The bridge will collapse in 2 months.
The crack follows the line of principal stress, not the mortar joint. The stone is exhausted. But the bridge can be saved. 1 week. 10 gold pieces.
Remove the cornice. Place 2 wooden supports under the arch at precise points.
8 men and a saw.
Holt is silent for a long time. Wind tears at her hair.
She looks at the bridge, at the drawing, at Dan. Then she says it plainly.
Lie, I'll hang you.
Tell the truth. I'll take you to the king personally. Dan nods. The terms are clear. The next morning, he stands on the bridge with 8 soldiers who have no idea what they're doing. Dan doesn't fully know either. He's a structural engineer, not a bridge builder. But physics is physics. Structural mechanics is structural mechanics. Load is load. He marks the points with string. He shows where to cut. Removing the cornice takes half a day. When the last stone lifts free, the bridge shudders. Every soldier freezes. Not Dan. He was expecting this. The bridge shed its excess weight and redistributed the load. The crack didn't grow. A good sign. By the 6th day, the supports are wedged in, the cracks filled, the bridge standing straighter than it has in 20 years. 10 gold pieces instead of 100. 6 days instead of waiting 6 months for mages who may never come. Holt stands on the finished bridge and kicks it. The bridge does not shake. She looks at Dan. She isn't smiling.
But her eyes are different.
Tomorrow, she says, we ride to Cainholm, to the king. Dan asks how far.
4 days on horseback.
Dan says he doesn't know how to ride. Holt replies, then it will be a very long 4 days. She is not wrong. Those 4 days turn out to be the worst of Dan's life. Worse than his structural mechanics exam in his junior year. Worse than a 15-hour shift on a construction site in Dubai.
The horse hates him. He hates the horse back. It is mutual and total.
Holt rides ahead and does not look back. Dan shakes in the saddle and tries not to think about the fact that he has no insurance, no medical cover, no documents, no money. He is a man in a foreign world, and the only things he owns are a notebook of calculations and a head full of engineering coursework from the University of Washington. At the first stop, he tries to talk to Holt. His German is terrible, but the local language lets simple phrases through. He asks what happened in the capital, why they need a builder. Holt explains briefly and without emotion. 2 years ago, the Silver Tower of Edelweiss collapsed. The younger princess died in the rubble, 40 courtiers with her. The Tower Mages Guild declared the runes had run out and tripled their prices. The treasury is empty. The steppe clans are pressing in from the north. Refugees are flooding the capital by the thousands. Dan listens and writes in his notebook. Not Holt's words. Numbers. Approximate height of the tower she describes. Approximate floors. Depths per square meter of base.
He already knows the truth before he's seen a single stone of that building. The tower didn't fall because of rooms.
The tower fell because someone built a high-rise without calculating the foundation.
He's seen it 100 times in disaster reports. Turkey, Bangladesh, Florida.
Buildings don't fall because of magic. They fall because of greed and ignorance. On the second day, they ride through a village.
Dan sees the houses, and his heart sinks, not from their beauty, from their horror. Crooked walls, roofs of straw soaked black, no chimneys, only holes in the roof.
Windows patched with bull's bladder, foundations of loose boulders piled at random. One good spring thaw and half these houses slide into the hillside.
Dan stops his horse and pulls out his notebook.
Holt rides up and asks what he's doing.
He says he's counting.
She asks what?
He says he's counting how many people will die in this village in the next fire.
She falls silent. He falls silent. They ride on. By the third day, he begins to understand the local language better. Not because he has a gift for languages,
Because the language of builders is universal. Stone, wood, water, wall, roof.
Holt starts to talk to him more. She tells him she is the daughter of an impoverished knight, that she has spent 10 years on the border, that she is tired of proving a woman can hold command.
Dan tells her that on his construction site in Seattle, the foreman is a woman named Ruth who can stop a concrete mixer with a single glance. Holt doesn't know what a concrete mixer is, but she appreciates the idea. On the fourth day, they leave the forest, and Dan sees Cainholm. The capital of Valderin sits in a valley between two mountain ranges, split down the middle by the Gray Scrap River. And the first thing Dan sees are towers. Dozens of them, slender, tall, crooked, jutting out of the cityscape like rotten teeth. Each tower belongs to an aristocratic family. The higher the spire, the older the family. Dan looks at them and calculates angles of inclination, base widths, height to cross-section ratios.
Not a single one would pass a seismic safety test by 19th century standards.
they stand on magic and prayers, not on calculations.
He tells Holt that half these towers will collapse within 50 years.
She replies that one already has. They enter through the north gate, and Dan cranes his neck at everything. The streets are narrow. The pavement is uneven. There is no sewer system. Sewage runs in gutters along the houses, and the stench brings tears to his eyes. Down by the river, wooden neighborhoods of commoners are crammed together. Damp, crowded, catastrophic fire risks. Dan sees traces of a recent fire. 2 blocks burned to the ground, charred beams jutting from the earth. People live in shacks built directly on the ashes. He jots it down. Fire breaks, stone firewalls, a water pressure system. 3 words that could save hundreds of lives. But first, he has to survive the meeting with the king. The audience takes place the next morning. The throne room is long and cold. Tapestries hang on the walls to conceal the cracks. Dan sees them anyway. He sees the left column bearing more weight than the right because the floor has sagged. He sees ceiling beams starting to bow, windows too large for the wall thickness around them, masonry tracking like spider webs. King Ansel IV sits on the throne, a thin man in his 50s, gray face, tired eyes. Beside him stands an advisor in the robes of the Tower Mages Guild. Holt introduces Dan. She says he is a foreigner who repaired a bridge without magic in 6 days for 10 gold pieces. The guild advisor immediately declares this impossible. Without runes, the bridge will collapse within a month. Dan takes out his notebook and opens it to the bridge calculations. He walks to the advisor and shows him the numbers. He asks if the advisor can see these figures. The advisor looks and says he sees scribbles. Dan nods. He says these scribbles explain why the bridge stands.
He says it is called a load calculation.
Each number represents weight in pounds. Each arrow shows the direction of force. A bridge is not magic. A bridge is geometry and physics. The advisor smirks. The king raises his hand, and the smirk disappears.
Ansel looks at Dan and asks if he can repair more than bridges.
Dan says he can build anything that stands on the ground and shouldn't fall.
The king nods and offers a test.
The west wall of the city guard barracks collapsed 3 weeks ago. The guild has requested 400 gold pieces and 2 months for repairs.
If the stranger can do it cheaper and faster, the king will consider his case.
If he cannot, the stranger goes back to the mountains.
Dan asks to see the wall.
They take him there the same day. He examines the rubble, inspects the foundation, checks the remaining 3 walls.
Everything is clear within 10 minutes.
The foundation settled because there was no drainage.
Water washed away the soil under the base over years.
The wall didn't fall because it was old. It fell because it was standing in a puddle.
A drainage ditch, soil compaction, a new foundation on a bed of crushed stone. A wall of hewn stone on lime mortar. No runes, no magic.
130 gold pieces, 3 weeks.
The royal treasurer looks at the estimate, looks at Dan, looks at the estimate again.
He says quietly that it's 1/3 of the guild's price.
Work begins the next morning. Dan stands before a pile of stones and 10 soldiers assigned to him in place of laborers.
The soldiers look at him like a nuisance.
He looks at them like a resource.
He divides them into 3 groups immediately. 4, clear rubble. 4, dig drainage. 2, cut lumber for formwork.
Simple tasks, step-by-step instructions, demonstrated by hand and drawn in the notebook.
The soldiers aren't builders, but they know how to follow orders.
And Dan knows how to give orders that even someone picking up a shovel for the first time can execute.
20 years on construction sites taught him one bin.
There are no bad workers. There are only bad foremen. On the 3rd day, he hits his first problem. Half the blocks from the collapsed wall are ordinary gray sandstone.
The other half glows faintly blue where chipped, enchanted stone.
Dan strikes the enchanted block with a hammer. The hammer bounces off. He strikes harder. The hammer bounces off again.
He writes it down. Runestone. Compressive strength unknown. Significantly higher than normal. Tests required. That is the problem. All his calculations are based on standard material properties. But in this world, half the materials are imbued with magic and behave unpredictably.
He cannot take a textbook formula and plug in the numbers. He needs new numbers, his own. He spends 3 evenings in the barracks running primitive tests, loading stones, measuring deflection with a wooden ruler, striking them at varying force, soaking them, freezing them.
By the end of the 3rd evening, he has a table. Rough, inaccurate, but real. His numbers. For this world.
On the 7th day of construction, an inspector from the Tower Mages Guild arrives. A fat man in blue robes with gold embroidery. He declares the work illegal. No guild license, no runic consecration of the site, no magical inspection of materials, no approval from the Council of Masters. Dan listens and nods. Then he pulls out a scroll bearing the royal seal. A direct order from the crown for this exact work. The inspector's face turns red. He says this violates the guild's charter and he will file a protest. Dan says he can file whatever he wants. The wall will be ready in 2 weeks. The inspector leaves. Dan knows this is only the beginning. On the 10th day, he realizes he needs more than muscle. He needs a mind. Someone who understands local materials. Someone who knows how enchanted stone behaves. He asks the soldiers if they know a stonemason, a good one, not from the guild. One soldier mentions a woman, a former guildmaster, expelled 10 years ago, lives in the slums by the river, drinks, repairs wells for food. Her name is Linnea Ask. Dan finds her in the basement of a dilapidated house by the riverfront. A dark room smelling of damp and cheap wine. A woman of about 27 sits on the floor chiseling a stone the size of a fist. Her strokes are slow, precise, even. Her hands know what they're doing. Dan sits across from her and watches in silence. Linnea doesn't look up.
She says if he's there about a well, show her where it is and pay 3 copper coins.
Dan asks why she was expelled from the guild.
She is silent. Then she says she suggested counting the arches with numbers. She wrote a formula for load distribution in a stone vault. She showed it to the masters.
The master said it was heresy, that arches were held up by runes and the will of the gods, not numbers.
They stripped her title and drove her out. Dan opens his notebook to a blank page and asks her to draw the formula.
Linnea looks up for the first time. She looks at his hard hat, his vest, the notebook.
Then she picks up a pencil. Her hand trembles slightly, not from drink. She draws for 10 minutes.
Dan watches. The formula is rough, incomplete, built in unfamiliar symbols. But the essence is correct.
10 years ago, Linnea Ask independently derived a simplified version of the arch-span theorem.
Without a university, without textbooks, without a calculator.
With a pencil and stones.
Dan takes his own pencil and finishes the formula. He adds the second load component, the coefficient of friction between blocks, the moment from deadweight.
Linnea watches his hand, the numbers, the arrows.
She holds her breath. And then she says quietly that her whole life she felt the arch could be built better.
That the numbers had to work. That stone obeys not prayers, but laws. She just never knew which laws.
Dan closes his notebook.
He says he needs a master craftsman who understands the stone of this world, who knows how enchanted mortar and runic masonry behave, and who isn't afraid to do the math.
He asks if she will come.
Linnea is silent for a minute.
Then she stands up, wipes her hands, and says she needs a bath and a new hammer.
Dan says there's no bath yet, but there's a bucket of water and soap.
And the hammer at the construction site is a good one.
She is right about the drainage slope too. The local soil is clay. The water drains more slowly than he calculated.
Dan writes it down without argument. The barracks wall is finished on the 18th day, 3 days ahead of schedule. 120 gold pieces instead of 130. The new wall is thicker than the old one. Proper drainage, gravel bed foundation, correct mortar joints, not a single rune. The royal inspector taps on it. The wall doesn't shake. He kicks the foundation. The foundation doesn't budge.
He writes in his report that the work is accepted. That evening, King Ansel summons Dan to a second audience.
This time, the throne room is fuller.
Advisors, aristocrats, 2 mages from the guild in blue robes, and standing alone by a column in the corner, a young woman in gray, straight-backed, cold-eyed, a high-colored dress the color of mourning.
Dan doesn't know who she is yet.
He finds out later.
Princess Eliza Valderon, the eldest, the sole heir since her younger sister died under the rubble of the Silver Tower of Edelweiss 2 years ago. She stares at Dan with an intensity that is hard to read.
The king says he is impressed. The treasury saved nearly 300 gold pieces on a single wall.
He asks if the stranger can do anything else.
Dan says he can. He says he has walked through the city. He has seen cracks in the palace walls.
He has seen the river neighborhoods that will burn in the next fire.
He has seen the towers that will collapse.
He says he can draw up a list of urgent repairs, prices, deadlines, priorities.
The king looks at the guild mages. They are silent.
The king tells the stranger to draw up the list.
In the corner, something flickers in Eliza's eyes.
For the next 2 weeks, Dan doesn't build anything. He walks. Every day, dawn to dusk, through Cainholm with a notebook and a tape measure.
Linnea walks beside him and explains what he doesn't understand.
The city opens up before him like a patient on a surgeon's table.
A sick patient.
He starts with the bridges.
3 cross the gray river inside the city. The old royal bridge is stone, sturdy, built by someone who cared. The north bridge is wooden and rotten.
The south bridge is stone, but has sagged a hand's breadth on the left side, a crack running the full length of the arch.
He notes them all. He moves to the walls.
The city walls curve around Cainholm in a semicircle, ancient, thick, but cracked in 3 places.
In one section, the masonry has tilted 4 degrees outward.
A little more, and 50 meters of wall will come down onto the suburbs.
He notes it.
He moves to the residential quarters. This is the hardest part.
Wooden houses packed so close together, you cannot slip a hand between them.
Not a single fire break. Crooked chimneys running through neighboring walls instead of through roofs.
No concept of sewage. Waste flows through the streets into the river, from which people downstream draw drinking water.
Dan stands by the river watching this and thinks that every sip of water in this city is a gamble.
He notes it. He moves to the aristocratic towers.
Fascinating and terrifying. Each tower built in a different century by a different mage with a different set of runes and no common standard. Dan counts 42 towers within the city walls. 12 he assesses as critically dangerous.
One tower belonging to the Kesselman family has leaned so far that the top floor hangs over the street.
In Seattle, this building would be demolished today. Here, people walk under it every morning on their way to the market. By the end of 2 weeks, he has a document spanning 32 pages.
Red marks for what needs to happen immediately. The South Bridge, a wall section, the Kesselman Tower, drainage in the lower districts.
Yellow for what can wait 6 months. The North Bridge, Palace Foundation repairs, 3 mid-sized towers. Green for what is needed for the future. Fire breaks, a sewer system, a water supply, new housing.
He presents the report at a third audience. This time, the hall is packed. Everyone has come. Dan spreads his blueprints on the floor in front of the throne because there is no table big enough.
He kneels because he needs to show the drawings and begins.
He starts with the South Bridge. The bridge has sagged due to erosion of the left support. Repairs will cost 200 gold pieces and take 1 month.
If left unrepaired, the bridge collapses in a year, and half the southern district loses its connection to the center.
He moves to the city wall. A buttress system is needed. A mage asks why stone supports are needed when a stabilization room could be cast instead. Dan says a stabilization room costs 50 gold pieces and needs renewing every 10 years. A buttress costs 30 gold pieces and will last 300 years without maintenance.
The hall buzzes. He moves to the Kesselman Tower. He says it needs to be evacuated and reinforced immediately. The tilt is critical. The next winter thaw could be its last.
A man in an expensive doublet rises from the hall. Lord Kesselman, red with fury. He declares that his tower has stood for 200 years and will stand for 200 more. That the foreigner is insulting his lineage. Dan looks at him and says calmly that the tower has stood for 200 years because it has been lucky. And luck is not a foundation. Kesselman steps forward. Holt steps between them, hand on her sword. The Lord backs away. The king raises his hand. Ansel looks at 32 pages of blueprints covering the floor, every crack in his city, drawn and calculated.
He asks how much it will all cost.
Dan says the urgent repairs will cost 1,500 gold pieces, medium-term repairs 4,000. The king closes his eyes.
1,500. There is less than that in the treasury.
Then Eliza steps away from the column. She walks over to the blueprints and sits down next to Dan on the floor.
She runs her finger over the drawing of the South Bridge and asks quietly why he has drawn 2 repair options.
Dan says the first is more expensive but more reliable. The second is cheaper but will need repairs again in 20 years. He is offering a choice, not a solution.
Eliza looks at him. For the first time in 3 meetings, something other than coldness lives in her eyes.
Interest. She stands up and tells her father that the Silver Tower of Edelweiss cost 5,000 gold pieces.
Renewing the runes every 10 years cost another 1,000.
And the tower fell. And it killed her sister. The hall falls silent. Eliza says 1,500 gold pieces is less than the price of a single dead tower.
If a stranger can repair an entire city for what one tower cost, then perhaps it is worth listening to him.
The king looks at his daughter.
He looks at the blueprints on the floor. He looks at Dan, still kneeling beside his drawings.
He says one word.
Get started. Dan gathers the blueprints and goes to work.
The first job is the South Bridge.
Not because it is the most dangerous, but because every person in the city crosses the river every day.
If a stranger without magic repairs the bridge cheaper than the guild, the whole city will know.
Dan understands this. The king understands this. Eliza understands it better than anyone.
She comes to the site on the very first day, in a gray dress with a notebook.
Dan wasn't expecting her. She says she will be watching.
He says she can watch from anywhere except under the crane's boom.
She asks what a crane is. He explains it is a device for lifting heavy objects, and that he is building the simplest version on the shore because hauling stones by hand wastes time and energy.
Eliza writes the word crane in her notebook.
Dan assembles a team, 10 soldiers. Linnea as senior stonemason, 4 day laborers hired at the riverport. Among the day laborers is a small, wiry woman with a sharp accent and an axe tucked in her belt.
Heijin, a refugee from the eastern lands, a carpenter.
Dan notices her immediately, not because she is a woman among men, but because she is the only one of the 4 who picks up the log correctly, both hands, from below, straight back. The others grab it however they can.
She knows what she's doing. Dan asks if she can make formwork from a blueprint.
Haijin studies the drawing for a long time. Then she asks what those lines with numbers mean.
He says they are dimensions. He points to the tape measure.
Her eyes widen. She asks where he got such a tape with markings on it.
He says he brought it from home.
She touches it with one finger.
Then she says she will make the formwork.
Dan draws up a project schedule that no one in this world has ever seen.
A long scroll, days running horizontally, tasks running vertically.
Each task marked with a bar, bars crossing and running parallel.
Some tasks can happen simultaneously, others only after the previous one is complete.
The critical path is highlighted in red. Linnea looks at it and says it is beautiful.
Dan says it is called a Gantt chart, and no serious construction project can do without one.
Linnea asks who Gantt was. Dan says he was a good man.
3 weeks in, the guild moves against him.
2 masons quit the same day without explanation, then a third.
The lime supplier says he is out of stock.
Dan checks. He is not out of stock.
Someone paid him not to sell.
Without lime, there is no mortar. Without mortar, there is no masonry. Without masons, there is no work.
The guild has been controlling the supply of building materials in the capital for 200 years.
A merchant who once tried to sell stone without the guild seal had his shop burned down.
Dan sits on the riverbank and thinks.
He could complain to the king, but every complaint is politics, and every request for protection makes him dependent.
He needs a technical solution.
He looks at the river, the bank, the gravel in the shallows, the clay in the cliff face.
All the raw materials he needs are right here under his feet.
He doesn't need someone else's lime. He can burn his own.
He sketches a lime kiln in his notebook, a pit lined with stone, limestone loaded on top, firewood underneath.
900 degrees. Achievable with ordinary firewood, no mage required.
He shows Haijin the sketch. She looks at it and says she can build such a kiln in 2 days if he gives her people. He gives her 3. 2 days later, the kiln stands on the shore. 5 days after that, he has his own lime.
Cleaner and cheaper than what the suppliers were offering.
Haijin stands by the kiln looking at the white chunks of burnt stone. She says her grandfather made something similar for boat varnish, but not as hot.
Dan says the principle is the same. Heat, chemistry, patience.
She looks at him and almost smiles.
Almost.
When the guild discovers Dan is burning his own lime, they send another inspector.
This one is thin and furious. He declares the production of building materials without a guild license is prohibited by royal decree.
Dan asks to see the decree. The inspector says he will produce it in court. Dan says he looks forward to it.
He jots down the date, the inspector's name, his exact words. Every conflict documented, every threat recorded. He already knows this will go to court. He is building his case the same way he builds walls, stone by stone, with a margin of safety.
By the end of the second month, the bridge is half finished.
The left pier is reinforced. The crack in the arch is patched. The scaffolding is in place.
Eliza comes to the site and for the first time doesn't stay on the shore.
She walks up onto the bridge. She stands next to Dan.
She looks at the even masonry joints, the neat mortar lines, the plumb shoring. She says she has never seen anything like it, that it doesn't look like a construction site, it looks like the work of a watchmaker.
Dan says construction is exactly like watchmaking, only the clock is very big and very heavy.
Eliza says she wants to understand. She wants to learn to read blueprints.
Dan is quiet for a second.
Then he says he would be glad to show her.
That evening, he sits in the barracks drawing a tutorial sketch for the princess.
Simple, with explanations.
Linnea sits across from him doing the same for the 4 day laborers who asked her to teach them how to read his plans.
Hygiene sharpens an axe in the corner and pretends not to listen.
But Dan can see she is memorizing every word.
He looks at these 3 women in the dim light of the oil lamp.
And he thinks, this is it. This is the beginning.
The South Bridge is completed in the 4th month.
Dan stands on the bank and looks at it. The arch is even, the joints are neat.
The left support is reinforced with the first concrete foundation in the history of Volderan. The keystone has been replaced, new railings, drainage on both sides.
The bridge is not beautiful in the decorative sense.
The bridge is right.
Those are 2 different things. The final cost is 192 gold pieces. The guild had asked 600. The treasurer closes the expense ledger and looks at Dan as if he has just turned lead into gold. Eliza stands on the bridge and does not look at the book.
She asks quietly how long it will last.
Dan says with proper maintenance, 100 years. Without maintenance, 50. Without rooms, without magic, without the guild's 10-year payments. She nods and leaves without saying goodbye. 3 days later, Dan hears the name people have given the bridge while buying bread at the market.
The Stranger's Bridge.
The vendor's husband walks across it every day, she says. And for the first time in 10 years, it doesn't sway.
Dan pays for the bread and walks on.
He doesn't like the name, but you don't get to choose names. That same week, the Tower Mages Guild declares Dan a heretic, officially, with the guild seal and a public reading at City Hall. The charges state that he is practicing construction without the blessing of the rune masters.
That his methods insult ancient traditions.
That his structures are dangerous without magical protection. And that anyone who hires or helps him is subject to excommunication from guild services. That last point is the most terrifying. Excommunication means no mage will renew the runes on your home. In a world where every 3rd building is held up by magic, this is tantamount to a death sentence for a house.
2 day laborers from Dan's crew leave that same day. The lumber supplier cancels his contract.
Even the soldiers the king assigned begin to look nervous.
Holt comes that evening and lays her sword on the table.
She says 3 aristocrats have filed complaints with the king, that the guild demands Dan be expelled from the capital.
That Master Cedric Vane has written personally to the king, warning that the Stranger's Bridge will collapse at the first heavy flood, and the blood of the townspeople will be on the crown's hands.
Dan asks when flooding usually occurs.
Holt says late spring. 2 months.
Dan nods. He shows Holt the drainage system he built into the bridge.
He explains that it reduces water pressure on the arch, that he designed the bridge to withstand flood load with a 30% margin of safety.
The bridge will hold. Holt looks at the drawing. She doesn't understand the numbers.
But she has watched Dan work for months. She knows every word he speaks is backed by calculations.
She says she believes him, but faith won't stop the guild.
Dan says he needs an ally inside the guild, someone who understands magic and isn't afraid to think outside it.
Holt is quiet. Then she mentions a girl.
Vane's own niece, Maribel. She has been seen in the library at night, searching through records about runes and numbers.
Dan asks Holt to arrange a meeting.
4 days later, he sits in a tavern near the market square. Maribel Vane is 19 years old, ink stains on her fingers, tired eyes. She arrives in a simple dress with no guild insignia.
She sits down and is quiet for a moment.
Then she says she came because she saw his drawings.
A guild inspector had brought copies as evidence of heresy.
Maribel saw something in them that no one else had noticed.
The load lines in Dan's drawings coincide with the lines of the rune field. His calculations describe the same forces that mages intuitively sense when placing stabilization runes.
For mages, it is a feeling in the fingertips.
For Dan, it is written in numbers.
Dan listens, and for the first time in 4 months in this world, feels goosebumps run down his spine.
If she is right, then magic and physics in this world do not contradict each other. They describe the same thing in 2 different languages.
He asks Maribel to draw the rune grid a mage would place on a simple arch.
She takes a pencil and draws.
Dan overlays his own load calculation on top.
The lines almost match. Almost, but not completely. There is a discrepancy at 2 points. He asks, what is happening at those points?
She says the runes are reinforced there because mages feel them as weak spots. Dan points to his own calculation. Those same 2 points show maximum stress.
The magers were sensing what he had calculated.
They both fall silent. Maribel's hands are trembling.
She says if her uncle finds out she came here, they will lock her in the guild tower.
Dan says he won't force her. The choice is hers. She looks at the superimposed drawing for another minute. Then she says she made her choice long ago.
She made it the moment she saw his lines and realized she wasn't crazy.
That the numbers worked. That ruins weren't prayer. That everything could be calculated.
3 days later, she leaves the guild.
The scandal is enormous. Vane announces his niece has gone mad under the influence of a heretic.
Maribel arrives at the construction site with a bag of books and a rune tablet. She stands before Dan and says she is ready to work.
He asks her one question. Not how the guild would connect 2 stabilization runes at a joint. How she would.
Maribel thinks. Then she says there must be a 3-millimeter gap between the runes because they expand when activated, and if they touch, they interfere.
Dan writes it down. An expansion joint for runes, just like the expansion joint in concrete.
He looks at her and says, "Welcome to the team."
By the 6th month, a crisis is brewing at the northern gate. The steppe clans are pressing against the border. Thousands of refugees have poured into Cainholm. New camps of rags and sticks spring up weekly. Children in the mud, old people under open sky, women boiling river water, hoping it will be enough to keep them from getting sick.
It is never enough.
Dan knows what needs to be done. He has known since the first day he saw that camp. Now, after the bridge, he has resources, workers, and permission. He goes to Eliza with the blueprint. Not to the king, to her. Because after 4 months, he has understood one thing. The king makes decisions. Eliza prepares them.
She is in her office on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, a small room, a desk buried in papers, a map of the kingdom on the wall with pins marking the positions of the steppe clans.
Dan spreads the blueprint on top of her papers.
A residential neighborhood, not a palace, not a tower.
20 houses, each for 4 families. Stone walls, wooden floors, 2 stories, tile roofs, stove heating with pipes running through every room, chimneys inside the walls, windows, outhouses on each floor with cesspools outside the block, fire breaks between every building, a well in the center with a stone rim and a lid.
Eliza looks at the blueprint for a long time.
She asks who it is for.
Dan says refugees. She asks how much. Dan says 1,000 gold pieces for the entire block.
5 gold pieces per spot, per family.
She looks up and asks if he is joking.
The silver tower cost 5,000 and housed 1 family.
He is proposing to house 80 families for 1,000.
Dan says he is not joking. He says a tower is a luxury. A house is a necessity.
Luxury is expensive because it is useless. Necessity is cheap because it is rational.
2 days later, he receives a royal order to build a residential neighborhood for refugees on the vacant lot by the North Gate.
1,000 gold pieces from the war fund.
He assembles the team: Linnea, Hygen, Mirabelle, 10 soldiers, and for the first time, 20 volunteers from among the refugees themselves.
People building their own home?
Mirabelle places minimal runes on the foundations, not for tradition, for waterproofing.
Dan discovers the water-repelling rune outperforms any waterproofing method he knows. 1 hour of work, 2 gold pieces, instead of 20 for bitumen treatment that doesn't even exist in this world.
This is the first true union of magic and engineering. Not one replacing the other. Integration.
The rune does what it does best. Engineering handles the rest.
Mirabelle works and glows, not with magic, with happiness.
For the first time in her life, someone asks what she thinks. For the first time, her runes are part of a system.
The refugees work with an urgency that makes Dan's throat tighten.
They haul stones at a run. They mix mortar without stopping. Mothers come to the site with babies on their backs and lay bricks with one hand. He remembers the migrant workers in Dubai who built other people's homes while having nothing of their own. Here it is different. Here they are building for themselves.
Hygen builds the roof truss system with a pitch she calculated herself from 3 generations of carpentry knowledge living in her hands.
Dan checks her calculation. The difference is 2 degrees. He tells her, she says 2 degrees is nothing.
He says 2 degrees means 2,000 liters of snow on the roof that may or may not slide off. She adjusts the angle. That evening, she asks him to show her how he calculated it.
He shows her. She listens and nods. Then she says her grandfather calculated the same way. He just never wrote it down. And when he died, his knowledge died with him.
She says she will write down everything she knows.
Dan gives her a notebook. The refugee neighborhood is completed in 9 months. 20 houses, 80 families, 312 people.
Dan knows the exact number because Eliza keeps the lists.
She comes to the opening in dark blue. For the first time in 2 years, she is not in mourning. Dan notices. He says nothing.
An elderly refugee woman enters her room on the 2nd floor. 4 walls, a window, a stove, a wooden floor.
She stands in the middle and cries, not from grief.
Dan sees it from the hallway. He turns away and climbs to the roof.
It is easier to breathe up there.
That evening, Eliza finds him sitting on the steps, writing in his notebook.
She sits beside him. They are silent.
Then she says she wants to show him something. She asks him to come to the Royal Library.
He comes the next morning. She is waiting by the far wall, holding a very old scroll. The leather is cracked. The ink has faded.
She unfolds it on the table. Dan looks at it and freezes.
An arched bridge, with load calculations, with a moment diagram, with a cross-section of the support.
The symbols are different. The language is different.
But the mathematics is identical.
In the lower right corner is a signature, Master Alaric, and a date, 322 years ago.
Dan sits down because his legs get out. Someone 3 centuries before him drew exactly as he draws.
And in the corner, a notation, Portland mortar, a 1:3 ratio. Portland cement. 300 years ago, someone had been here before him.
Someone who already knew everything he knows.
And that someone was burned for heresy.
Eliza says Alaric was burned by the guild 300 years ago, accused of witchcraft, of desecrating tradition, of heresy against the runic order.
His drawings were sealed, his works destroyed, his name struck from the register of masters.
Dan asks if there were others.
Eliza reaches into the box and hands him a yellowed scrap of paper.
Dan takes it and reads. The note is written in English, modern English, the crooked handwriting of a man in a hurry.
It says, "If you are reading this, you are just like me. Do not trust the guild. They know. They have always known. Run or hide. I did not make it."
Dan sets the note on the table. He looks at Eliza.
He tells her it is written in his language, in the language of his world.
That Alaric was just like him.
That someone in the guild has known that people like him arrive and has been eliminating them systematically for 300 years.
Eliza says she suspected it from the moment she read the indictment against Alaric. Too fast, too organized. As if they had a plan already prepared.
Dan puts the note in his pocket and tucks Alaric's sketch into his notebook.
He tells Eliza that now he definitely will not leave.
Someone 300 years ago tried to do what he is doing and was killed.
Everything they knew died with them. 300 years of lost progress. 300 years of houses burning and towers falling. 300 years of people dying from diseases a sewer system could prevent.
He will not let that happen again.
Eliza looks at him. Then she says quietly that her sister's name was Katerina.
That she was 17. That she loved to draw birds.
That on the day the tower fell, she had climbed to the top floor, because from there you could see the swallows nesting under the eaves. Dan is silent.
Eliza says that for 2 years she believed it was the will of the gods. That's what everyone told her.
The tower fell because the runes ran out. No one was to blame.
And then a stranger came with a notebook and a tape measure, and in 2 hours calculated that the tower had been doomed from the moment the foundation was laid. It wasn't the gods. It was a mistake. Her sister didn't die because of fate. She died because of someone's incompetence.
Dan tells her that if she wants, he will design a place for Katerina. Not a tower, not a monument, a place she would want to visit.
Eliza's eyes are bright, but she does not cry. She nods. What follows is a year of building, of fighting, and uncovering a truth that reaches 3 centuries into the past.
The first assassination attempt comes at the end of the 9th month. Dan is working a night shift on the city wall when he hears a sound, a quiet creak, wood against wood. Not the normal creak of scaffolding, the creak of a sawed-through beam.
He freezes, drops to his knees. His hand finds the cut in the wood beneath him.
Deep, almost all the way through.
2 more steps forward, and he falls 12 meters onto the rocks.
Slowly, distributing his weight across the planks, he crawls backward to the stairs and climbs down.
Below, the site is dark and empty. Whoever sawed the beam is already gone.
A professional.
In the morning, he shows Holt the sawed beam. Then he shows her a second beam beside it with a steel core inside.
He installed it the first week he worked on the site.
He already knew someone would try this.
It's a classic, the easiest way to stage an accident on a construction site.
He's an engineer. He always builds in a margin of safety.
Holt looks at him and says he is crazy. He says he is paranoid. Those are 2 different things. A paranoid person survives. Weeks later, Dan and Mirabelle break into the guild's basement through an old drainage channel.
They find a sealed stone door. Mirabelle studies its runic lock and begins working on the combination.
Dan looks at the door differently. He sees the hinges. Stone, set into ordinary sandstone on 300-year-old lime mortar.
Whoever placed the magical seal on the door did not think about the wall beside it. A mage thinks about magic. An engineer thinks about construction.
20 minutes of chipping old mortar and both hinges are free. Dan and Holt lean into the door and push it aside. The seal still glows. The lock is still locked.
But the door is no longer in the doorway.
Inside, on a single table, is a box of scrolls.
15 protocols, 15 people, over 300 years. Name, date, method of elimination.
The executor's name is identical on all 15. Archon. Not a name, a title.
The handwriting across all 15 protocols is identical, the same person. 300 years.
Someone in this city has been hunting people like Dan for 3 centuries.
The trial takes place in the Great Hall of the Town Hall, before 3 Lord Magistrates and a packed audience.
The Guild presents 12 counts of illegal construction, illegal material production, illegal teaching, and undermining national security.
Dan responds not with a defense, but with an attack.
He presents fragments of the Silver Tower, the foundation calculations that prove it was doomed from the day it was built.
He names the young mage who designed it 40 years ago, Cedric Vane.
The hall erupts. Vane goes white.
Dan says he does not accuse Vane of intent. The mistake was a mistake, not a crime.
But the guild covered it up. When the tower fell, they knew the real cause and blamed the runes instead.
Because if buildings fall from rune depletion, more runes are needed. But if they fall from bad calculations, runes are not needed at all.
He places all 15 protocols on the table. 300 years. 15 murders dressed as accidents or executions.
The magistrates read. The guild's lawyer calls it forgery. Dan agrees he broke into the basement illegally and is prepared to answer for that.
But he asks the court to order an expert examination of the documents. He will wait. The Guild loses its monopoly on construction by royal decree signed in that courtroom. And somewhere in the city, whatever has hunted engineers for 300 years begins to look at Dan Cross differently.